Hey everybody, welcome back. It is Friday. We made it through the week. If this is your first time to this channel, I'm Eric Murphy, and I have been putting out content like Murphy's Law, where I go over calls to different atheist call-in shows, and on Fridays I sit and have good conversations with Christian apologists. With me today is Randal Rouser. Hey Randal, how's it going?
It's going awesome. In fact, the day's really picking up since I arrived on your show. So.
Aw, shucks. Look at that. See? You're a nice guy, man. I appreciate it, man. I appreciate it. I actually saw that you linked the show on your website too. So
you've carved out a nice little enclave of irenic, so cordial and rigorous conversation. It's in the midst of the blooming buzz of the internet, it's a nice respite to come here.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I appreciate that. So long as we can address the issues and we can take the gloves off when it comes to ideas, but we can treat each other as people who deserve respect.
Absolutely.
So now that we agreed that we're happy with each other as humans, let's take the gloves off and dive into some theology here. So, where were we? We're continuing. This is part 3 of our conversation on morality. And actually, if people did not see parts 1 and 2, I'm going to put a little link. It should be popping up right now, so people can click part 1 and get associated with what's going on. Our first conversation was about what is properly basic, essentially.
Oh, yeah.
Our second conversation was what do you think? I would say that it kind of meandered around a little bit, but it largely focused on whether or not morality is objective. And we kicked that back and forth for a while. And right at the end there, we started to get into God.
Yes.
Yeah?
I think that's a good summation. Yep.
Good. Okay. So we have talked about whether or not morality is objective, and I think I have a good view of where you're at, and I think I have a good view of where you think I'm at. So let me try and see if we're on the same page here.
Sure.
You agree that morality is objective and that it exists without humans, and even if humans weren't around, morality would still be there because it's something that comes from God.
Okay. I'd want to qualify. So first of all, to say morality is objective is ambiguous as to what that exactly means. So what I would want to specify is that when we talk about morals and ethics, so that the ground level is moral value and moral obligation. And moral value pertains to the properties of goodness and evil, and moral obligation pertains to the properties of right and wrong. So they're sort of, in a sense, derivative of the existence of moral evil. In light of moral good and moral good and moral evil, in light of that, this is how we ought to act and how we ought not to act. And so in that sphere, I'm arguing, yes, there are moral facts about good and evil and right and wrong, or how you ought to act and how you ought not to act, which exist independently. Their facticity or their truth is independent of what any human being thinks about them or any subjective finite mind thinks about them. And that's the claim. Because if we just say morality is objective, it's not quite clear what that would mean, because of course there are all sorts of relative grasps of the understanding of morality, and you can get into the descriptive accounting of morality and so on. So that's just, I want to be clear.
Okay. I mean, see, I can't meet you quite where you're at, because when you say moral facts and the facticity of moral judgments or moral values, I obviously don't follow you there. Largely because I think when I was watching back on our last episode, and I'm glad that you're bringing up the different ways we look at morality, because that is actually something I did my homework on, which I'm happy about.
Excellent.
But moral obligation in particular is one that I'd love to talk about. But first, I saw and the way that we explored it last week, when I said I agree that morality or morals can be objective, so long as we're agreeing that they're objective. It seems like you were chiming in with, but isn't that your subjective evaluation, right? Was that kind of where you were going? Because there was a point there where I was saying, hey, if we agree on what the objective is, then we can have objective morals because we can compare acts to that thing and see if it lines up with the goal. And and you were saying, but it's still reliant on us.
Yeah, see, the problem there, I think that seems to me there's a conflation of meaning with words. So if we talk about objective, it sounds like what you're talking about is having a goal. And when I say objective, what I'm talking about is something that exists independent of the mental dispositions of finite minds.
Okay, so
a different kind of thing we're talking about. So we can all have objectives that we agree to through cultural conventions. For example, we can something like hockey is a game that was established through cultural convention, and then getting the most pucks in the net in a finite amount of time in 3 periods, that's the goal. Literally, the goal is to get goals.
Sure.
And so that's the objective. But that's a culturally relative objective.
Okay.
But what I'm talking about is facts, things that exist independent of what we think about them. So if you can do it in a counterfactual way, you can say, regardless of what anyone thinks about the truth of X, it is true that X. Okay. So for Derek Chauvin to put his knee into the neck of George Floyd and kill the man, I would say that was an objective evil. It was murder. And even if everybody decided with the Derek Chauvins of the world that was morally justified, it would still be the fact that it is evil, and we would all be wrong. So that's what makes it an objective fact.
See, there are a couple of pieces there. First, I agree with you in the end result. That is terrible. I think evil is kind of wishy-washy as a word, so I try to avoid it because it tends to lead down rabbit holes that are just not fulfilling. and I'm sure you could probably get where I'm going there. If you want to talk about it, we can, but the existence of evil is not something that I think is true the same way 2 + 2 = 4 is true. And when you're talking about moral oughts, let's be clear. You're saying that the facticity of the statement that murder is evil or murder is bad is something that exists outside of us. So do you think morals can exist without minds?
So I'm saying moral facts, right? I've defined in terms of moral values. So morals is a little bit ambiguous again, because moral can refer to like mores, morals, cultural conventions or practices. So what I want to be specific is, yes, moral values, good and evil, right and wrong, would exist even if we did not exist as moral agents in the world to act in the moral sphere.
Okay. So,
much like analogous to a Platonist who says that mathematical objects would exist even if there were no minds to think about them. There would still be the number 1 and the number 2, etc.
So that's a little bit to tackle. So can we agree on the phrasing moral evaluations? Values carries its own baggage that I think could kind of take us down a different place. But if you're talking about a moral evaluation of something, then I think that I could probably follow you and we could talk about what that moral evaluation is, just like how you said murder as an example. You gave a moral evaluation to that.
Yeah, that's a moral, or I'd say moral judgment. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Judgment.
So,
that works.
But what a moral judgment is it's an assessment as to whether a particular state of affairs, such as a man being killed by a cop, is or is not morally justified. And if I make the moral judgment, it's not morally justified. What I do is I say that state of affairs exemplifies the objective property of being evil. Right. I thought that it's interesting that you said evil seems to you as wishy-washy. Actually, to me, it seems precisely the opposite. It is good and evil are among the things that to me seem most vividly to be the case. Like a few years ago, I did a lot of reading in genocide, and it was part of some research I was doing. And I read a lot of the Rwandan genocide of 1994. And some of the accounts that you have of the decimation of villages, of UN peacekeeping forces coming in and seeing skeletons of women with, so the bodies had rotted away, but then there were still knives or other implements jammed up into the pelvis, and you could see how that they had died. That seems to me, when I see that, that is as much a fact that is evil as it is a fact that it is sunny out today, or that 2 + 2 = 4. They're just strike me with their brute objective facticity that it is the case.
So something can strike you in a way that doesn't necessarily lead you to whether or not something is true. It just says how you feel about that thing. When you're talking about something as heinous as that, I want to be clear. I also feel feelings. I also think that that is truly terrible. And I'm not, and I want to make sure that what we're not doing is, and if we are, I want to call this out. We're not appealing to the idea that just because I don't think it's objective, it is somehow devalued or lesser. Because if that's the case, then we've got a mountain to climb. Because me saying that we evaluate a thing and judge it to be moral or immoral does not mean that it is any way less atrocious of a thing that happened. And if that is the case, then I've got a lot to say about the God that I think you believe in. So let's be super, super clear. Just because I think it's subjective in that way, in a way that morality exists outside of us, I don't follow that. And even if I did, wouldn't it only exist in the mind of God? Wouldn't that be God's subjective evaluation? I mean, yeah. So ultimately it's subjective. We just don't get to play by the same rules God does.
So let's put it this way. Again, I was talking about counterfactuals. So one of the reasons that I say it's objective is, again, even if every finite mind said other than X, it would still be the case that X. So even if the Hutus had won, and history is told by the winners, and everybody was convinced that it was objectively the case that the Tutsis needed to be eradicated, and their eradication in 1994 in Rwanda was morally justified, it would still be the case that it was wrong, it was evil, and that everybody is incorrect.
Well,
and the reason is because it's objective. And if you deny that, it seems you are, to my mind, failing to grasp with the full depth of the moral facticity, objectivity.
I'm glad that you're saying that, because I want to put my foot down on that. I think we live in an unfair world. I think it's a terrible world. That said, I fully grasp how terrible it is. I don't think that it's in the same way that people talk about Alcoholics Anonymous. You can't get over addiction yourself. You need an outside source because you're not strong enough. I think that's a load of crap. And I think it causes people to devalue their own strength. And to hand off moral evaluation, to me, devalues that. And let's get into Euthyphro. Sure. So are we judging a thing to be moral because God told us to? In which case, we would not be actually people acting on our own agency, especially not when it comes to morals. Somebody can be entirely immoral, but because of fear of the stick, they decide to behave in this way handed down by God. Or are we recognizing something and going, you know what, this matches our values, this appears to be moral, at which point, why God?
So I don't know if all of your listeners are familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma or not. Sure. So maybe it would help to unpack it. Sure. So Socrates, in one of Plato's famous dialogues on the Euthyphro, he raises this dilemma: is something good because the gods command it, or do the gods command it because it is good? And the dilemma purportedly is, on the one hand, if it's good because God commands it, then morality is rendered arbitrary. If God commands it because it is good, then you don't need God to ground morality. No. Well, yeah. So the first thing I wanted to say in response to the dilemma is that the first thing the dilemma is pushing us toward, I think rightly, is a recognition of moral objectivism, that morality is something we discover. You see, Plato was aware of moral relativism. He famously interacted with an ancient relativist named Protagoras, who says that man is the measure of all things, that really we decide for ourselves what is the morally good thing to do. And Plato and Socrates believed, no, that morality is discovered. Plato believed there was an objective moral good that we discover. If you and I could agree on that, then we could have the next question about how morality relates to God.
Sure.
But you're not quite there yet.
No, well, here's the thing. I think the idea of a platonic realm, this intangible realm that we're all somehow in touch with and are reaching into that realm to name things, that there is a platonic chair, and that is the essence of all that is chair. And so we view a thing to be a chair because it in some way is a lesser version of the platonic chair that exists in nowhere land. It's a nice idea, but I think it's nonsense. It is just on its face nonsense. If you want to talk about numbers, we can talk about the way we describe things, but would you really think that there's a platonic apple, that there's a platonic couch?
So I want to start off with the statement nonsense.
Sure.
So Platonism is, Alfred North Whitehead famously said, and he was one of the leading intellectuals of the 20th century. He said that Western philosophy is but a series of footnotes to Plato. Now that's a little bit of a hyperbole, but nonetheless, he is making a very important point there. There is a reason that actual technical philosophers working in metaphysics still debate and defend Platonism to this day. So to talk about Platonism as nonsense, I think is a little bit misguided.
Why? I mean, so Isaac Newton was an alchemist. To say that alchemy is nonsense does not devalue what he did do. It just calls it for what it is.
Okay, let me put it this way. Like, why do you think philosophers defend Platonism?
Oh, because they believe it.
So there's no rational basis for them defending Platonism? I mean, what is Platonism invoked to explain?
Sure. Okay, so if we're going to talk about what is rational and what is irrational, we need to really be clear on our definitions here. So if a thing is rational, and let me give you two definitions and let's see which one you're working with. And if you're working with one that's neither, then I'd love to hear what your definition is so we're not talking past each other. The definition of rational that I have come across is, in talking to apologists, is internally consistent. So if something makes sense in the grounding of the worldview and the way that they understand the world, they're rationally holding it. They're not behaving outside of what they view and how they view that the world works. That's the first definition of rational. The second definition that I've come across is there sufficient evidence to justify believing it? And that, I think, is a more useful definition because I think that's what can convince people. Which do you subscribe to either or neither?
Well, those aren't exclusive. One can believe in internal consistency and coherence as one aspect of rationality, and another one is the external relationship of one's beliefs to the evidence. So I think you can have both, but I'm still like, there are good reasons why Platonists appeal to a Platonic account, in contrast to conceptualists and nominalists, which are the other two main views in the philosophical tradition. So I mean, Platonism is first of all invoked as a theory to explain attribute agreement. What is it when you have a red apple, a red fire truck, a red fence? They all seem to share this thing called redness. What is this thing that they all share? And there are these three perennial accounts of what it is. And the Platonic account, a realist account, is to say they all share this objective quality of redness. And so the Platonist invokes this account of that which is red, an account of redness, which is an abstract property, or what is often called a universal, which can have this unique primitive relationship of being multiply exemplified in countless concrete particulars. So you could have a red fire truck, you could have a red apple, you could have a red fence. That is a theory to account for attribute agreement. The other thing that Platonism is commonly invoked for is to explain abstract reference. So for example, when I talk about justice, if I, for example, I say, in the court, justice was done today. What is this thing, justice, that I'm referring to? Or if I say that rape was evil, what is that quality of evil I'm referring to? And that's another area where Platonism can be invoked, is to explain the basis of abstract reference. So there are reasons why people are Platonists, and there's serious reasons, and that's why philosophers today who defend Platonism are not just defending nonsense. It's a serious position.
It's a serious position to them. I understand that, and I understand that you're pointing out that there's value in that in the way that you pointed that out. I don't think that matches reality, and so in the hey, this is a fun thing to talk about sense, yeah, absolutely. But in a I'm trying to make an evaluation of the world around me sense, no, it's nonsense. To me, it's nonsense. And that's fine. If somebody is a Platonist and wants to come on the show and talk to me, I'd love to talk to them. But there are a couple things therein that I disagree with. The first is if there's something that exists in a realm outside of us, how are we accessing that realm?
Yeah, so that's the idea of how do you intuit or grasp abstract universals, right?
So I can actually answer that.
Yeah? Sure. How do you do that?
So abstract concepts are concepts, and concepts are things. They are things that we learn, and they are things that we understand. There are also things that, in an evolutionary sense, we have a basic function of. I mean, we see it in monkeys, right? There's this feeling of fairness. It comes from being a social species. And in saying that, I am not remotely devaluing it. I'm just describing it.
Are you a conceptualist or are you a nominalist?
Well, let's go over definitions, because honestly, I don't want to mix things up. Would you be so kind?
So conceptualism traces back to Aristotle. And so Aristotle, of course, was Plato's student, and every good student finds a way to disagree with your master. And so Plato believed that universals do exist, in fact, as necessary abstract objects or universals, and then they can be exemplified in multiple concrete particulars. Aristotle said, well, the universals do exist. They are something in addition to the concrete particulars. So redness is a thing, distinct from all the red things in which it is exemplified. Nonetheless, Aristotle believed that redness only exists insofar as it is exemplified. And then the nominalist says there is no actual ontological reality of redness that is shared by all of these things. All that there in fact is that the appearance of things that look alike, and so we group them together using names. So nominalism comes from the Greek nomos, or name. And so those are the three different views. There's right. Strengths and weaknesses with each view, but I don't think any of them is nonsense.
Well, if I have a tool that I'm using, if I have a epistemic tool, and let's point out one that we can both probably agree on pretty easily. It's true because it's old, right? It stood the test of time. Therefore, it is most likely to be true. If I held that and I judged things and went, well, depending on how old it is, I will assign a higher truth value to it. I think you would agree with me that that is a bad tool to understanding the world, because what's to stop me from reading the Iliad and immediately thinking that there were cyclopses and that you could capture the wind, things like that. Would you agree with me that is a bad tool?
I don't think that that's quite relevant here. Let me suggest that.
I'll tell you why.
Okay. Yeah.
But would you agree with me that that's a bad epistemic tool to use if your goal is to understand reality and to have a view of reality that most accurately maps to the world that we're living in?
I think that, first of all, I think your tool is a little vague, but okay. I also actually do think in many cases it is a valid tool. So, for example, if you come to a new town, mm-hmm. and there's a restaurant that's been in that town for 120 years, and there's a mm-hmm. restaurant that opened up last week, all things being equal, and that's what we're talking about, all things being equal, the restaurant that has been established for 120 years is probably going to be better than the one that just popped up, because restaurants that endure over a long period of time tend to be the better ones. Now, that's not an absolute, but it is something.
It is something, and it can coincidentally be true. But it is not true because it is old.
But good restaurants tend to endure over time.
But it is not good because it is old.
No, and again, cool. It's a first principle, right? It's first principle is ambiguous. What I mean is it's a modest, all things being equal principle. So if you've got these two different restaurants, there's nothing else separating them except the one's been around for 120 years, the other one opened up last week. Yeah. I'd say go to the 120-year-old one.
Sure, if anything, because you'll learn a little bit of history while you're there. But I'm not talking about subjectively going, let me try this a different way. I'm specifically talking about truth. Sure. I know it's very pragmatic, but if we don't cut through to the meat, I'm sure we'll be bouncing around quite a bit. So in a pragmatic sense, my goal here is to understand and get to learn as many true things as possible and have the best tools to be able to filter out as many not true things as possible. And when we're looking at our evaluations of things, I think the Platonic idea, right, the entire Platonic concept doesn't stand up in that sense. I don't think it stands up in I'm trying to use this as the best tool available to understand reality. And in that way, I think it's nonsense. It doesn't mean it's not fun to talk about. It just means that, do you think that there's a Platonic realm?
Yes, I would call myself a Platonist.
Okay. So how do we access? Go ahead. I asked.
Yeah. So let me just say one thing. So to just come back to the principle and so on. So I would suggest like here's the implication of your statement.
Sure.
The implication is that philosophers, people who have thought really hard about the topics of philosophy, many of them recognized as among the leading intellectuals of world history, for the last 2,400 years, the vast majority of them have taken Platonism very seriously, certainly in the West, where this has been the conversation, have taken Platonism very seriously, even to the extent where Alfred North Whitehead could say Platonism, history of Western philosophy, is but a series of footnotes to Plato.
Sure.
So they've taken it very seriously, and to take it seriously entails it's not nonsense. Even if you end up disagreeing with the theory, it's not nonsense. To say it is nonsense requires one to say that the vast majority of philosophers who have taken Platonism seriously for 2,400 years are really kind of foolish because they didn't recognize that it was nonsense. And that just seems to me very implausible as a hypothesis.
So what? I mean, you're appealing to it, they would look foolish. I mean,
no, I'm saying it's implausible that the vast majority of people who devoted their life to that. It's like saying the vast majority of climatologists who say that climate change is a thing are endorsing something that's foolish.
They have access. They have access to climate. If you can show me this access to a Platonic realm, I'll grant that those things are similar. But until then, I don't see how this escapes an ad populum argument.
Not at all. An ad populum argument moves from many people believe X, therefore X is true. I'm not making that move. I'm saying many of the people who are most informed about a topic have thought X was not nonsense. Okay. Therefore, X is probably not nonsense.
Okay.
And the burden of proof is on the person who wants to argue that it is nonsense. Now you said, well, they have climate. Well, where's the equivalent climate for the Platonist? Well, there have been reams, there have been volumes, books written defending Platonism. I mean, I can give you a bibliography of books defending Platonism with very sophisticated arguments. Now, I gave you a quick summary on attribute agreement and abstract reference. I've hardly scratched the surface as to why people are Platonists.
So I as an idea, I understand that a lot of people take it seriously and have taken it seriously. The purpose of this is to determine whether or not it is true, not whether or not there's value in it. And you're right. My statement about it being nonsensical doesn't have to do with whether or not it's true. So I apologize. I want to keep this in a truth discovery place. So whether or not it makes people look foolish doesn't matter. Whether or not a lot of people have believed it doesn't matter. Whether or not, people tie themselves very closely to it or it doesn't matter. because none of those things have a bearing on truth. And I don't think we can access truth. Right out of the gate. I don't think we can access truth. Capital T truth is not something we have access to. We have lowercase.
Now, is that what is the difference between capital T and lowercase t? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So the best method that I've seen that we can use to investigate the world around us is one where we form a hypothesis, we determine how it can be falsified, and then try to predict what would happen if, we conducted the test, we conduct the test, and we can continue to prove things wrong. That's what science does. It doesn't prove things right. It just continues to try to prove things wrong. And if you keep going and keep going, you keep trying to prove it wrong, you keep adding falsifiability, you are continuing to, it's still standing up, but it's not going to be what we accept until we prove it. Like once we prove it wrong, it's out the window. And so because of that, we don't have a positive way of accessing knowledge. We have a way of figuring out whether or not something is not the case, but we don't have a positive way of accessing that. And so I don't think we have access to capital T truth, because even if we did coincidentally or through, vigorous examination actually have the right of a thing, if we knew exactly what a thing was and that thing was true, even if we agreed on it, and even if we had a high degree of confidence of it, we don't have a way to verify that truth in a satisfactory way. I don't think that I hold all of my views with degrees of certainty, right? I don't believe 100% in anything, and I live my life trying to establish, okay, well, I have X certainty that this is the case, but I could be wrong. And because of that, we only have access to lowercase t truth. Unless we're talking about semantics, right? If we're talking about married bachelors, then obviously, we can define things that way, and that's how we can get to deductive logic. But if we're not talking about things that are just defined as such, no.
Like I worry that when you talk about capital T and lower T truth, what you end up actually doing is blending truth into knowledge. Because I'm happy to say we have lower T truth and only lower T truth in the sense that all of our knowledge is fallible and open to revision. Mm-hmm. But actually truth, I understand truth to be a correspondence relationship of a proposition to a state of affairs or a fact. So the statement or the proposition, it is sunny today, is true if it corresponds to the state of affairs of it being sunny today. In other words, if it is sunny today, you can also state that in deflationary terms.
So I'm glad we finally have a place that we agree. I also subscribe to the correspondence theory of truth. So good. Okay. We at least have a grounding there.
So then when you say lower T truth, are you really saying all of our knowledge is fallible rather than that there's some kind of different kind of truth than another kind? Because it's all correspondence truth, right?
Yes. So the thing is, I think the idea of capital T truth is one that doesn't help a lot. I think
what I'm not clear what the idea is.
Sure.
What is the idea?
Absolute truth. Because knowledge is fallible, right? You summed it up very well. Because knowledge is fallible, we don't have access to absolute truth. And because of that, I think it's a kind of useless. That lowercase t is there because I'm observing and recognizing that I cannot knowingly have absolute, truth about a thing. And because of that, I'm aspiring the best I can, but I'm never going to reach it.
All right. So it does seem to me then that when you say lower T truth, you're talking about what I would call fallible knowledge. And sure. I'm okay to move on that basis.
Cool.
Now you asked about how do you know universals or Is that right? Yeah. How do you
Close
come into
enough.
contact with universals? How do you come to know them if they're abstract?
Wait, how do we come to know them if they're abstract? I don't know if that's quite right. Let me see here. So I was saying that we don't have a way of accessing absolute truth. Is that what you're talking about? Like, how do we know whether or not something is absolutely
You were
true?
raising an epistemological objection earlier, as I understood it, to Platonism.
Yes.
That if there are these
Okay,
abstract
yes.
universals, how do you come to know them?
Okay, so specifically, I was asking you: is there a Platonic chair, or a Platonic couch, or a Platonic apple?
Yeah. So when I would understand myself to be a Platonist. The way that I would understand that is that more primitive properties are the things that exist as abstract objects. So, for example, the property of redness, or the property of abstract properties such as humanness would be something. Or in language, you could have propositions. So a proposition is a meaning, and the meaning can be inscripted into various different statements, but the meaning is independent of all the statements. And so meaning, propositions is another area, or another one is numbers. We've talked about numbers. So I think those are all examples of Platonic objects.
Okay, and I would say that they're not objects at all. They're adjectives.
Yeah, I think that they're, for example, I think that...
Like wetness. Do you think wetness is a thing that exists outside of things being wet?
If you're a Platonist and you believe that there's an abstract property of wetness, a universal, then yes, so by definition.
I'm not. I don't have access to Joe Platonist, but I have access to Randal. Does Randal think that wetness exists outside of things being wet? Like that there's some Platonic realm where wetness is an object.
Yeah.
Because objects are tangible. Objects are things. Objects aren't adjectives.
No. Concrete entities. Universals by definition are abstract. They're atemporal. They're aspatial.
Okay, hold on. So
that's what a universal is. Unless you're like D.M. Armstrong or a small minority of universalists or Platonists who believe that they are temporal. Most universalists believe they're atemporal. Yes.
Okay, so you understand that time and space. And energy, these are all things that are intertwined, right?
Are you talking about an Einsteinian universe?
Special relativity, E equals mc squared, right? That you can move things around the equal sign.
Einstein's universe is consistent with an absolute Newtonian now. Well, it only shows that it is inaccessible to us.
Okay, follow me with this really quick.
Yeah.
You cannot multiply by 0. If you do, the whole equation turns into 0. When you multiply by 0, everything else is gone. Okay, so atemporal would be without time. So t would equal 0. And in that equation, without time, you do not have mass or energy. You have non-existence. And non-existence is not something that you can make any claims about, because the second you do, by set theory, it is no longer in the empty set. It is now in the set of all things. So, no, I help me out here, because that does not make any sense to me.
Atemporal just means absence of temporal succession.
Okay, so
there's no before and after. It's just that temporal properties do not apply to that reality.
Well, I when you're describing a thing, you're describing the information about it. If I'm going to describe a chair, I'm going to talk about the legs that it has, the color, that it is, the shape, the size, all of those things, right? Those are all adjectives. You don't have, bring me the 5 inches. That is a concept that we use to describe a thing. But in that same way, if I ask you to take me to the park and you hand me a map and point where the park is, you have not taken me to the park. You have pointed out where the park is. And it appears to me like you're confusing the map for the place in talking about adjectives as nouns.
Hey, do you know Schoolhouse Rock? Did you grow up with Schoolhouse Rock? Because you just put the, so she took out her adjectives. Remember that song?
Yeah.
That was one of the Schoolhouse Rock songs.
Dude, I told you, when I think about the number one, I think of Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to have that in my mind all day. So she took out her adjectives. Sure. So listen, why don't we, we're running out of time.
Are we?
And
no!
I fear...
Oh, we didn't get to God. We were supposed to get to God.
Well, I got a few more minutes, but what I want to maybe do then is kind of tie this in back, rather than talk about properties abstractly or about non-moral properties. Let's just talk explicitly about good and evil being exemplified. And so ask, so how do I perceive or grasp good or evil being exemplified within a concrete state of affairs, like, or an event, like the state of affairs of slavery being perpetuated as an institution, or an event of a person being saved from a perilous situation when the person saving them puts their life at risk. And so I say that's a good, noble act, or a person being assaulted as Mr. Floyd was, where that's an evil act. And I say that those actions, events, states of affairs exemplify properties of good and evil. To tie in the epistemological question, so how do you know that? And I would say, I do believe that human beings have a moral perceptual faculty, that we look, and we've been equipped with this, we look at the world, and this distinguishes us from non-moral agents, and we can perceive moral qualities. And we are, if we're morally properly functioning rather than like a clinical psychopath, then we are attracted to those events that are noble, that exemplify morally good, moral goodness, and we are repelled by those actions that exemplify moral evil. How we do that? Well, I mean, this is a great question about all of our cognitive faculties. Do you know even sense perception? I was reading a few years ago in a metaphysics journal talking about theories of sense perception. There are three main theories of sense perception: the adverbial sense data theory and the theory of appearing. And this individual, he says, our philosophical theory of how sense perception works, how you see things, like not the neuroscience, which is another totally different issue, but this is dealing with consciousness and the experience of seeing something. He says our theories have not noticeably improved over the ancient Greeks. So if I want to talk about moral perception, you can say, yeah, how does that work? I said, great question, but it's no less perplexing a question than how sense perception works.
So no, we are talking about a neurological thing when you're talking about your senses, unless you're talking about qualia. And if you're talking about qualia, we can have that discussion another day. I disagree that qualia is useful in any meaningful way. I think it is a concept and something we can talk about, but I don't think qualia gets us out of the fact that perceiving things means having the parts of a body that act to have those perceptions. And that comes from sending signals to the brain. Without a brain, you would not have those perceptions. You wouldn't have those senses. Without eyes, you wouldn't see. Without ears, you wouldn't hear. Unless we want to get really pedantic and talk about cochlear implants. But you need those things. Those are essentially tied to a body. And in that way, my skin feels. There are a lot of things my skin does. My eyes see. What part of the body is tuned to good and evil except that which we tie to our societal? You have nature and nurture, right? You have those things that we view as a social species that's ingrained into us, and those things that we learn societally. I don't see how you could possibly get away from that. Now that said, you do not own good. I can say something is good and subjective, and that absolutely makes sense. It absolutely, as a sentence, makes sense. You can disagree with it, but it makes sense. And so it appeared to me that there was an implication there that you need to have objectives to make a determination about a thing that's useful. And I disagree with that entirely. There's an implication there that maybe you'd like to clarify, because people who hold objective morality do not have exclusive rights to talk about whether something is good or not.
Well, so there's several things here.
Sure.
I'll just briefly address that. We can all talk about good and evil, right and wrong. The question is, which account is most plausible based upon all the things that we believe we know? And I do think moral objectivism is best in that regard. But you said, just kind of were dismissive of qualia. Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me that tasting peppermint or smelling cinnamon is a different kind of thing than neural synapses, even if that thing arises from and is intimately connected to neural synapses. So the qualia, the experience of tasting peppermint or smelling cinnamon, is just a different kind of thing than neurons firing in my brain. And we have to account for and explain for both of them. And I think Frank Jackson's famous knowledge experiment, although he later on came to be critical of it, I don't think that his criticisms are sustained. And I think it's a very legitimate argument.
Sure. So you have emergent properties, right? Our consciousness, I will tell you, is an emergent property of having a brain. Why? Because you don't have one without the other. If you want to remove the synapses and tell me that that person is experiencing that taste, then I'll follow you. But until then, if you put someone in an MRI and watch their brain light up and go, that is that person tasting that thing. That is the physical correspondence to what is going on.
Exactly. Physical correspondence is not the thing itself. It's the physical correspondence to the thing. And the thing that we're talking about is the qualia.
They're the same. They're the same. Otherwise, take the neurons out and tell me how you're going to taste it.
No, all that's showing is that there's a conjunction of these two things, and perhaps it's a necessary conjunction, but that doesn't show they're the same thing because they have different properties. Because you can know every.
Give me one property of qualia that's not based in material things.
This is Frank Jackson's thought experiment. You could know everything about the brain and still not know what it is like to see the color red.
Yeah, wasn't he the one who said, "What does it mean to be a bat"? Was that Frank Jackson?
Or no, that's Thomas Nagel.
Sorry, Nagel. Or was he the one who talked about zombies?
David Chalmers.
Okay,
you're probably thinking of there.
Okay, never mind. I get and I understand the arguments that are being made. It just, there are no properties outside of what property does a thing have? Give me a property that's not described by the discrete brain state that corresponds to its experience.
So again, like to go to the knowledge experiment, in the famous knowledge experiment that Jackson came up with, there's a woman named Mary. She's raised from a child in a room of black and white, never leaves the room. Mm-hmm. And in the room, Mary studies on the computer and becomes the world expert in the brain states that occur when a person sees the color red. But Mary herself has all her life been in this room in black and white. And she writes her doctoral thesis on what people experience in their brains when they see the color red. And then one day she's finally let out of the room after she submitted her doctoral thesis. And the first thing happens is she sees a red rose and she says, that's what red looks like. And what that tells us is that you can know everything about the neural synapses of the brain when you experience red, and yet you cannot know based upon that what red looks like. What you can only get, the only way you can learn about what red looks like is by experiencing it for yourself, not by looking as a third person on a person's brain firing.
Well, no, actually, if I understood what the discrete brain state of somebody looking at a red thing was, and identified what that red was, I could tell you if that person is seeing red. I'm not saying anything about that person experiencing red. You're confusing the third party with the experiencing party. Those are different things. Experiencing a thing doesn't give. Anyway, we're way over time.
Well, yeah, that is only the case if you are a type identity theorist, that you believe all brain states that correspond to red are of the same type, so that you could identify them.
No.
But even if you can say, okay, that's person's experiencing red, unless you've experienced red and seen it for yourself, you still wouldn't know what they were experiencing, because knowing their brain state is not knowing the experience that they are undergoing, which is the qualia.
Yeah, I really don't. I don't see that. I don't see that at all. Just because you're experiencing a thing, it maps to you having a physical body. it maps entirely, right? That gets right back to conversation number one, Calvin's sense of the divine, that we have some kind of godometer, or we have some moralometer, or we have some way of interacting with things outside of our physical bodies, as if there is some part of us that is outside of that, this mind-body dualist position. It's a position that we've been walking around during this entire conversation, and one that I have consistently been bringing you to. There are absolutely fantastic explanations to things without having to appeal to something we have no evidence of. We have no evidence of a soul. We have no evidence of a godometer.
Do you have the ability to proprioceive?
Yes.
How does that work?
How does that answer the question?
Well, the question in terms of, like, for example, earlier you said, well, this is how sense perception works in all of our senses. And I actually challenged that. I said, in fact, in philosophy, there's no consensus on how sense perception works. Some people endorse sense data theories. Some people endorse the other two theories I mentioned, theory of appearing and adverbial theory. But even setting that aside, I said, here's another cognitive perceptual ability we have, the ability to proprioceive. And for those who don't know, that is the ability to perceive the extensions of our body in space and how it relates to other objects in space. How does that work? Because
we evolved into it. If we didn't have it,
yeah, but how does it work? Like how does the actual thing work? Because I can give you the same answer that you just gave me.
Sure.
For moral perception. I can say, well, we just have that ability. We're given it. We evolved it. Whatever. But that's not an actual explanation.
Actually,
right?
It is, and that is my explanation. That is my explanation. So yeah, dude. Yeah. I mean, if we did not have that, those ancestors would not have lived on to procreate, and we wouldn't be here. The ones that were able to understand that they have a body. I mean, that's existent in animals. That's existent in any of those things that need to account for their own bodies. So
is your view that the only reason that we have the moral beliefs we do is because they have adaptive value, but not because they're true?
That's where I say that you're making a category error. The statement you just made is carrying inside of it the implication that there is moral truth. And I disagree with you. I think you're making a category error. And the category that you're putting it in is facts that exist outside of us. If there wasn't us, there wouldn't be our understanding of it. There wouldn't be the adjectives to describe things the way that we understand them. If you had another species that came up, then they can describe things just fine. But no, I think this is a category error.
So even if apples had never existed, it would still be the case that if you took two apples and put them along with two other apples, there would be four apples. You don't need to have apples actually existing for there to be facts about apples should they have existed. Likewise, you don't need to actually have sentient human creatures exist for there to be facts about the objective evil of rape or the objective good of compassion and nobility.
Okay, you don't own it. And no, that statement is one that carries inside of it so much condescension that I'm surprised.
What is condescending?
Sure. Rape, right? Genocide, those kinds of things, they're terrible. They're truly horrible. And if we had done them, if we had continued to do it as a species, just as a matter of day to day, this is what you do, we wouldn't exist. We recognize that it's bad because we agree to a few very, very important things, a few key things, so much so that we identify outliers as being abnormal. And that is our agreement that human flourishing and well-being are things that we should be striving for. And that seeing that not happening is something that we rebel against. And that's something that we both learn and have burned into our bodies. It's in our brains. You know, look at things like mirror neurons, right? We are geared towards being a social species because that's what we are. But to say that there is no truth if it's not objective is entirely missing the point. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because when we agree that rape and murder and those things are wrong, we have made that the objective. And because we understand that those things are terrible, that is why it is the case. In the same way that we talk about married bachelors, right? We have defined it that way. And because we have defined it that way, it is true. We can make deductive arguments about it.
Well, first of all, I don't see why what I said was condescending, because all I said was counterfactually, had there been no human beings, these things still would have been evil. That's all I said. I don't see why that's condescending.
Sure,
but I also would say, it seems like what you're saying now is you disagree with the Hutus. Okay, but there's no objective fact about why you're right versus the Hutus. What you have is a cultural relativism. You and your cultural goals, the Hutus and their cultural goals, okay. Hutus, specifically the Hutus that were perpetuating genocide, not the ones who rejected it, of course, but the ones that were advocates for it and were perpetuating in 1994. And you're saying, well, we don't like that, so relative to our moral consensus that we've agreed upon, that's bad, but relative to theirs, who's to say it's different?
Okay, so what? Does that make it untrue?
Well,
that
it seems to me
you just made make that statement untrue.
I actually do think it's very implausible. In fact, I would suggest it's a reductio ad absurdum to claim that there is no objective difference between your view of genocide and the Hutus' view who perpetuated genocide. I think they're wrong and you're right.
There is an objective difference. The difference is we as a society agree that what they did was wrong. That's the difference. The difference is you and I are both in the popular opinion. But to say that doesn't make it wrong, dude, we are agreeing that it is wrong. But to say, no, it's just like your opinion, man. Even if I were to grant that, even if I were to say, okay, those are synonymous, right? My opinion and their opinion. Does the fact that it is uncomfortable make it wrong? Because if that's the case, then we could go into Holocaust denial because, man, that makes me uncomfortable to think about. No, it happened. It's true. Just because something's uncomfortable doesn't make it not true. That's what I think that argument boils down to, is people don't want to stand in the uncomfortability of it.
No, I think that it's very implausible to claim that there's no objective difference between your view of genocide and the Hutus' view.
Who's objective?
In the same way, I've already defined objective as being independent of our attitudes about the issue.
Okay, then.
So in other words, that one person can be right and another can be wrong, and there is an objective difference. Just like if a person says 2 + 2 = 5, they're wrong. Right. Your view does not allow for moral improvement in society. All it allows for is moral change. So in your view, we now have a broad consensus view that slavery is wrong, but in the antebellum South, there was a consensus that slavery was morally good. And so there's actually no objective improvement. All there is moral change. And that, again, seems to me very implausible.
Right. So you're carrying improvement in a way that is subjective. Right? That is very subjective. And I agree that we've improved because this is where I'm at in 2020. And I think it is evidence of the fact that it is subjective because in the antebellum South, they disagreed with that evaluation. There are people who, for a very long time, held that owning other people as property was moral. They did that because that is honestly their evaluation, in the same way that this is your evaluation that it's immoral.
Yeah, there are also people who believe the Earth is the fixed center of the universe. It doesn't follow that there's no objective fact about whether the Earth is the fixed center of the universe.
No, you're conflating truth. You're doing it again. That is conflating truth with evaluations. No. It is true, the statements that we make about the physical world, right? We can determine whether or not something is true because we can determine whether or not it corresponds to reality. We agree with that.
That's a side issue. The issue here is that the mere fact that people disagree does not entail that there is no fact, objective fact, to settle the disagreement or not to settle it. Pointing out that different people have had different morals does not entail or support in any way subjective views of morality. It underdetermines that issue. And it doesn't give you evidence either way. And I would suggest that there is, again, there's clearly moral improvement, objective moral improvement.
So have we?
I think it's, yeah.
Have we gotten better at accessing objective morality? Have we gotten better at accessing the Platonic realm? Because the only way that I could see that being the case is if we have somehow gotten better at accessing those objectives. Otherwise, it's useless.
I think we are getting better in key respects. I think Steven Pinker, for example, presents a very plausible case in The Better Angels of Our Nature that societies are objectively, over time, becoming less violent and more just, to use John Rawls' famous definition of justice. And that is an objective improvement.
Right, because he's defining objective in a very specific way, and it's not the way you're defining it. He's defining
objective.
He's defining objective as that which comports to the objective that we have set out. We set out this objective. The objective
it's not just it's not a convention. It's not merely a convention that we decide. We're gonna pursue this because we've decided it, and so we create it like a social contract. It's an objective fact. Just society is an objective reality.
Well, you just referred to Pinker, and specifically, if you want to refer to that in his quote of saying that we are moving toward, objectively better society, I agree, because we have agreed on the objective, and that is how he's using that. So I agree. I agree. But because we don't agree on the definition, I believe to you it's still subjective. But I don't think you can have objective like that, because I don't think evaluations of things like that comport to truth.
Yeah, we're back to that. I think is a conflation of objective as meaning having an end or goal, but an end or goal that could be very well decided just through some arbitrary convention, versus objective as I have been defining it, which is a fact which obtains irrespective of the cognitive attitudes of any finite mind. But alas, I see that we're kind of running out of time here.
True.
We've been just brushing up against God once again for yet another hour.
You know what? Actually, I think for people who have followed this and want to follow it and look up the different things that we're talking about, they'll realize that for 3 conversations, we've been talking about God the entire time. We have. We've been talking about God this entire time. And
it's not time wasted, that is for sure.
No, it's not, because I have a better understanding of Randal. And everyone who watches this has a better understanding of Platonism and how that's defended and how it's talked about. And hopefully they're taking this time to decide and weigh the merits. So whether or not you and I disagree, I think we're doing a service. So.
And even if at the end of it all, we have agreed disagreeably, we've disagreed agreeably. We've accomplished something, I think, significant. So that's in and of itself a good thing.
Well, sir, I hope that someday we can meet so I can buy you a beer. This has been a lot of fun, man.
I'll get the second round.
Sounds like a plan. I know you've got some stuff to do.
You bet.
Thank you for joining me. Absolutely.
Good to be with you again.
Take care, brother. Okay, so that was my conversation with Randal. I jumped over to this part because I wanted to say goodbye and he had to leave really quick. But right here, hit subscribe because I've got new content coming out 3 times a week. If you haven't seen my first conversation with Randal, check this out over here. It is a really good start. And if you want to see Murphy's Law, a new show Mondays and Wednesdays, click right here. Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time.